Hello. Good evening and welcome, everyone. I love watching that wave of silence as it goes across the room. Good evening and welcome, everyone. Thank you for being here. Thank you to everyone who is watching this live streamed online. My name is Dil Sidhu. I'm the head of the business school here at Birkbeck, University of London. I'd also like to thank a couple of other people before we begin. First and foremost, David Gamblin, who is a senior faculty within the business school, who's going to be our moderator today. And David will be introducing our esteemed panel in a short while. For those of you that might be a little bit new to Birkbeck, a little bit of history for you. Birkbeck was founded in 1823 by Dr. George Birkbeck, who found that he had a calling to help democratize education for working Londoners. And he essentially set up what was the London Mechanical Institute, which then morphed into what is now Birkbeck and part of University of London. So in many ways, Dr. Birkbeck was an influencer and persuader in his own right, because there was plenty of forces that were against the average person or the working class Londoner to receive an education. And that also relates to social mobility, which Dr. Birkbeck and Birkbeck even today is a big fan of, ensuring that there is opportunities for people to move into new roles and new career aspirations as well. Now we're into our third century, and we've got new leadership in the form of a new Vice Chancellor, Professor Sally Wheeler. We've also got new programs, we've got technology in our learning, and we've got new learning choices. So we are known for our evening teaching, but we are also expanding into daytime offerings as well. And we're also developing new external relationships, both with the public, private, and not-for-profit sectors. And many of that is done with the guidance of our Board of Governors and our outstanding advisory and networking board, who's helping across the Faculty of Business and Law. Now, while we celebrate our achievements, our focus is on our students and the student outcome and the student experience. For those of you that may not know, Birkbeck is made up of 3 faculties within which there are 8 different schools, the business school being one of those. We also have some centers of excellence. We've got the Center for Innovation and Management Research, and we've got the Center of Counseling as well, and both are very, very renowned. A key area of strength within the business school is organizational psychology and behavioral sciences, and our faculty know the work of Professor Cialdini extremely well as well. Now, I came across Professor Cialdini's work back in 2001. I read an article called Harnessing the Power of Persuasion, and I have to admit, I was awestruck. I ran out and bought this book straight away and devoured it. And this is when it had only sold 1 million. Now it's sold 7 million, and it's much bigger than this because he's added on to it with new learning and new research insights as well. And I was completely taken aback by the ethical approach to influence and persuasion and changing behaviors. At that time, I was a deputy CEO at a London borough, and we had many issues that needed fixing, very little money with which to fix them. And I was helped along and mentored by Professor Cialdini's UK partner, Steve Martin, who is also part of our panel today, to get us to an outcome which was nothing short of outstanding in terms of changing behaviors, both for the community, for the services that were on offer, as well as for the services provided by the council as well. Without a doubt, Dr. Cialdini is a renowned psychologist. And the great thing I liked about his book when I first read it, in the introduction, he starts by saying, I'm a patsy. I'm a patsy or a pushover for people offering me things and for me to purchase those things. And I'm very much the same. Truth be told, I once put a card that I drove very little for about a year just because it seemed like a good idea at the time, and it was a great salesperson. That's not happened since I've read his book, I can assure you. The research that he has pioneered is wrapped around essentially 7 principles, and they work equally well on an ethical basis, whether it's the public, private, or not-for-profit center. I've actually used some of these principles on my children when they were younger. They've since found my slides, so that no longer works, and I'm sure it's working the other way around now. And one of the great things about Dr. Cialdini is, while of course he did plenty of research, he also did a lot of field research. So he took roles within sales roles. He sold everything from portrait photography to cars, amongst other things. And he became an advertising copywriter just to ensure he knew what works and what doesn't, especially in industries and with people who are reliant on influencing and persuading customers to ensure that they get paid or the bonus is made or whatever you like. So ethical influence, without a doubt, is a universal skill. And I am absolutely pleased that we have Dr. Robert Cialdini here tonight to address all of us and to also take part in our panel. So please do join me in welcoming Dr. Robert Cialdini.
Well, thank you, Dill. I'm very pleased to be here today. And I have a lot of people to thank. Did everyone get one of these? There's a special thanks to the person who selected the photograph of me that's at least a decade old. I'm very grateful for that. But I'm grateful as well for the great turnout here, and I want to spend a few minutes to just review what's new for me in the influence process. We've got 6 principles of influence that, if you read earlier versions of my book, were the standards that I suggested were the levers of influence that were going to be most powerful in moving people in our direction ethically. But I've added a new one called unity. I want to talk a little bit about that and the other principles of influence more quickly. But then another way that I've focused on something new is the efficiency of the process of moving people in our direction. Not just the validity of it, the extent to which it is effective, not only the extent to which it is ethical, not only the extent to which it is applicable, but what about the speed and efficiency in which we can create that change with the smallest number of units of effort or time, and so on. I want to talk about that, but let's first spin through the first 6 principles, and then I'll move on to these 2 sources of change. The first is the principle of reciprocation. People say yes to those they owe. So the implication is we go first. We give gifts, we give services, we give favors, we give resources, and people want to give back to us when we request something from them. The next is the principle of liking. No surprise, people prefer to say yes to those they like. And so the consequence is that we should show that we like them, because that makes them like us more than anything else we can do. Give approval first, it will flow back to us by the rule of reciprocation. The next is the principle of social proof, the idea that when people are uncertain, they don't look inside themselves for answers, they look outside, and one place they look is to their peers. What are those around them like them doing? And that's a good index of what they should do and likely be successful there. And the newest research shows that even if you don't have a lot of social proof in your direction, you don't have a lot of market share, you don't have a lot of popularity, if you can show a trend to the percentage of social proof that you have, you double your effect. Next principle is that of authority. Again, when people are uncertain, they don't look inside themselves for answers, they look outside, and besides peers, they look to the experts. What are the authorities? What are the people with the credentials saying and doing in that situation? The key is there's a particular kind of authority communicator that is more successful than any other we have ever found around the world. It is the credible authority. That is someone who doesn't just have knowledge, but also has perceived trustworthiness. So that experience and and background and those credentials, right, reflect information and knowledge that is presented in an honest, straightforward way, not designed to line their own pockets, only designed to accurately depict reality. If you have those two things, knowledge and perceived trustworthiness, no one can beat you as a communicator. All other things equal, no one can beat you. Next principle is the one of commitment and consistency. People want to be congruent with what they have already said or done or a position that they have taken, especially in your presence. They will want to show that consistency. All right? So if you can point to things that they have already said or done that are aligned with the position you would like them to take, you will have significantly increased the likelihood that they will then take those even much larger steps in order to be consistent with those commitments. And then there's scarcity. People say yes to you if you can show them that what you have is unique or uncommon or rare or dwindling in availability, because people want more of those things they can have less of. So if you can point to those features of what you have to offer, right, you will have increased the attractiveness of your case without changing the merits of it one bit. Okay, so those are the first 6 principles. Here's the new one, unity. Unity. People say yes to those who are one of them, not just similar to them, one of them, in a category that they use to define themselves. It can be a political category, it can be a religious category, it can be a professional category, it can be a region of a community. They define themselves as a we member of that group. If you can show them that you share that category, you can point to things that are. Let me give you an example from a situation that is not a business situation. It's a partnership, a relationship, right? A romantic relationship. Researchers did a study in which they took couples that had been together for at least 2 or 3 years and asked them to come into a laboratory where they said, we want you to find something that separates you, something that's a problem that you have not been able to resolve between you. And we're going to flip a coin, and we're going to ask one of you to persuade your partner to come into line with your position. And they did, and one was assigned the role of persuader, one was assigned the role of recipient, and then the researchers left the room, but they didn't really leave the room. They had one-way mirrors, they had videotapes, they had tape recorders running, and so on. So they knew what happened. And it turned out that there were 3 types of persuaders. People who the researchers labeled as the coercive, punishing others, who said, look, I need you to do this for me, and if you don't, I'll have to do something that you won't like. You'll be sorry if you don't move in my direction. Not only didn't that work, it polarized the other party further away, right? So that didn't work. That was, even though it was a large percentage of people, that's how they decided they were going to produce. We've had bosses like that, right? The other one that had a large majority of the persuaders, the researchers called those the logical, rational persuaders. They said to their partner, look, if you will just examine the situation more closely, you'll see that my position is the more reasonable and rational one. Right? That didn't produce polarization, it just produced laughter. Right? And they didn't get any change. But 15% Only 15% of the persuaders did the only thing that worked. The researchers called them the relationship raising group. They said to their partner, you know, we've been together now for 3 years. I wish you would do this for me. That's all. They brought to the surface, to consciousness, the fact that they were in a relationship. They were a unit. They were partners. And under those circumstances, they changed the mindset. What was brilliant about this was that the researchers set them apart, focused them on a difference. And those 15 wouldn't sit for it. They wouldn't stand for it. They'd say, that's a small part of who we are. The larger setting, the larger context of who we are is we are partners in a relationship. And when you are in a relationship, when you are in a we relationship with people, the research is clear. You get more helping, you get more cooperation, you get more trust, and you get more compliance. And those were the features that were brought to the surface. So, what does this have to do with business? I took this lesson in a particular problem I had not long after I saw this research study. I was writing a grant proposal that needed to be in the mail the next morning to be eligible for funding. And I was reading it one last time. I was going over every section of it, and I came to one section that was weak. I didn't really have a compelling case to show for the claims that I was making. But I knew that I had a colleague, let's call him Tim, who had done a study the year before. He hadn't even published it, but he had analyzed the data, and we had talked about it, and I had seen, and he had the answer. He had the evidence. Well, I emailed him. I said, Tim, and I explained the situation to him. I need to get this off tomorrow. There's this weak section. You have the data that would bolster it. Could you send me those data that I could put into my proposal and strengthen it along that dimension? Well, Tim was known to be an irascible, sour, grumpy man. He did not suffer fools gladly. So when I said, I'm going to call you and work out the details. I rang him up. He said, hello, Bob, I know why you're calling. And the answer is no, Bob. And I said, but I have to have this. I know you have the data, and I know, you know that I need it by tomorrow. And he said, I can't be responsible for your poor time management skills, Bob. Sorry. Before I read the research on unity and we relationships and shared identities, I would have said to him, come on, Tim, I really need this. It's due tomorrow. He had already said no to that. Here's what I said. Tim, we've been in the same psychology department now for 12 years. I really need this. And I had the data that afternoon. Okay, unity. That's what I'm talking about. We would be fools of the influence process if we had long-standing relationships with business partners, with clients, with vendors, and we were making a request to them in which we didn't precede that request by bringing to consciousness the extent to which we had an ongoing, existing positive relationship, because it changes the way people think about the next step to take with such a partner. Okay, so that's the principle of unity. Now let's talk about the efficiency part. And with Influence at Work, Steve Martin, who is the head of Influence at Work here in UK, he's actually authored a book called The Small Bigs. What are the smallest things we can undertake that will produce the biggest impact on our persuasive success? And Steve's is a master of not just doing small changes, but of installing procedures and circumstances within an organization, structure within an organization that allows people to produce positive change because there are structures inside that organization that lend themselves to it. But how do you get people to abide by those structures, to adopt these changes? Well, that's where small bigs come in. That's where efficient changes can be successful. So let me give you how it is that we came upon this idea of small bigs. I do talks like this, sometimes to audiences about this size, sometimes to larger audiences. It doesn't matter. If I ever say to the audience, now let's say I'm talking about a principle, whatever it is, the principle of social proof, whatever it is, authority, scarcity, whatever. If I say, now I'm going to give you the smallest thing you can do to harness the power of this fundamental lever of influence, the room falls silent. Pens poise over pads, fingers over keys, and I get the attention of the audience almost as completely as if I had mentioned sex. Why? ROI is why. Return on investment is why. But it's not the investment that we typically see, a small financial investment that leads to a large financial benefit. No, it's a small investment of time or energy or cost, right, that leads to a big impact on your success. So let's talk about a couple of those. Let's start with unity, the one we've already begun talking about, which says that if you can show people that you share, if you share a category with them, partnership with them, they'll be more likely to say yes. But it also turns out that if you undertake actions that create partnerships, you will then set the stage for unity-based successes. And for me, in the last 2 decades, the single most impressive marketing practice and customer retention practice I know is co-creation, where what you do is to say to your existing customer base, we would like to partner with you to help us generate the next generation of products or services or ideas. We want to partner with you. We want you to be part of the process with us. And the evidence shows that when you've done that and people are contributing in that regard, their favorability towards your brand goes up significantly, and their loyalty to your brand goes up significantly because you've brought them in as a we. Not someone to sell to, someone who contributes to the betterment of all concerned with this brand. Right? Okay, great. But what's the small big there? Because that's a large thing to do. Right? What's the small big? Well, the way people usually request that kind of input is by doing surveys or interviews or focus groups with people to get their input, to get them to make these contributions. And the way they typically ask for that input is to say, can you give us your opinion on what we should do next, how we should change, what we should lop off, what we should add on, and so on. And that's a mistake. Not to ask for that input, it's to ask for it in terms of an opinion. Because when you ask for an opinion, people step back from you psychologically, and they go inside. and they introspect. And you get a critic. If you change one word, here's the small big. Change one word and ask for their advice. And you get a partner. You get someone who's complicit with you in this process. You get someone who has joined you in a cooperative way, in a partnership-like way. And the research shows that not only do they become more favorable to your brand as a result, they provide better suggestions and recommendations for change because they are one of you. They want this to be true because they've been complicit in the process. They've joined in it. And the newest research shows that not only does the word advice work better than opinion, it works better than the other typical way that we ask for input, feedback. It works better than asking for feedback for the same reason. The American novelist Saul Bellow is attributed to saying the following. He said, when you ask for advice, you're usually looking for an accomplice. Here's what the research shows. When you get that advice, you get that accomplice. So that's a small big. Here's another one that has to do with the principle of commitment and consistency, where people want to be congruent with what positions they have already taken, statements they've made, actions that they've undertaken. I have a friend who called me. He's not really a friend. He's an acquaintance. He called me because he had a problem. He said he is a scoutmaster. He's got a couple of sons in the Boy Scouts, and they typically try to raise money for the Boy Scouts by selling popcorn outside of supermarkets. As people have left, they've set up a table with a banner for the Boy Scouts, and as people come, they try to sell them popcorn, and they're having very little success. And I know why. First of all, if people want popcorn, they could have purchased it in the shop, right? And besides, they've already spent their allotted money for their shopping budget, so they're very reluctant. Only about 15%, he said, actually buy popcorn. So I said, well, what do you say to them, Jim? What do you say when they come out? He said, we say, excuse me, would you like to buy some popcorn? And people mostly shake their heads. No, raise up. And then they say, it would support the Boy Scouts. Right? And they just don't get, because people, they've made a commitment to know. So I told them, try this, Jim. Ask them, do you support the Boy Scouts? And almost all of them nod, yes. Well, would you like to buy some popcorn? Because it's now 55% say yes. They're being consistent with the commitment that you, and as, by the way, you're asking them to be consistent with the commitment they truly have. They do support the Boy Scouts. They do. It's not like you're foisting superior preference for the Boy Scouts or valuation of the Boy Scouts on them. No, you're bringing it to the surface. They make a commitment. And he says, here's the best of it. Here's the best. Those people who don't want popcorn say, look, I don't want your popcorn, but I support the Boy Scouts, and they give us a donation. It doesn't even cost us the popcorn. Right? So these are the kinds of small bigs that I think are valuable. We're trying to do that within the approaches that we take these days, making our influence process efficient, not just valid, ethical, and applicable. So with that said, I'll turn things over to David.
Hello, everyone. My name's David Gamblin. I'm a senior lecturer in the Birkbeck Business School, and I think I've just made myself the most unpopular person in the room by cutting Professor Cialdini off from his talk. But I hope you will all join me in saying a huge thank you to Dr. Robert Cialdini for that entertaining, engaging, and enlightening keynote talk. And how wonderful it is as well to be celebrating 40 years of influence all together here at Birkbeck. In terms of scarcity, I think this is a wonderful and rare opportunity to be hearing from Bob live. But that's not all. We've got far more for you because we've got a wonderful panel as well that I'm going to introduce for you. So if we could all give a round of applause to welcome our panel members to the stage, and then I'll introduce them once we're seated. Come on up, everybody. You want this? Okay, everybody, here we go. This is your panel. And we've got some wonderful panelists for you as well. Of course, we've got Professor Robert Cialdini, which I think you're all getting nicely acquainted with. Best-selling author celebrating 40 years of influence with us today. We also have Kit Ayawevu, CEO of Mindweaver, and on the Board of Trustees for the African Diaspora Economic and Inclusion Foundation. Kit's work focuses on empowering overlooked and underemployed groups through emerging technology, helping support diverse teams and helping organizations to understand and embed anti-racism and racial equality. We have Stephen Cooper, CEO from Aldermore Bank. Stephen holds CEO positions at Barclaycard and Barclays Africa. He's a CBE and holds an honorary doctorate in banking and social mobility. Next along the line, we have Professor Almut McDowell. Almut is a professor in organizational psychology here at Birkbeck in the School of Psychological Science and the co-director for our research center in neurodiversity at work. Almut's research covers neurodiversity, well-being, policing, and the performing arts as a labor. And we have Steve Martin, a longtime collaborator and co-author with Dr. Cialdini. Together and with Noah Goldstein, they've written Yes and The Small Big, which we've heard a little bit about. And with Joseph Marks, he's written Messengers. Steve's the CEO of Influence at Work UK. So, welcome everybody. Okay, I'm going to give Bob a tiny rest, having just given the keynote. And with the first question, help you to get to know our panelists a little bit better and their connection with influence and the psychology of persuasion. So, my question is, where has the psychology of persuasion connected with your own organizational or research area? Steve, if I go to you first, and this is probably a big one, considering your organization is called Influence at Work. But are there any that you would highlight? Maybe your work through Messengers and who we listen to and why?
Yeah, I think there's two clear connections. And by the way, just for the record, oh, do I need? Is this better? How about now? Okay, thank you. There's clearly two connections. The first, the obvious one, is that 24 years ago, I think it was, when Bob and I first met, was a very lucky day for me. And I'm clearly now in a position where I'm standing on the shoulders of a giant, a founding father of applied behavioral science, and it's given me the opportunity to essentially play in the world and apply these principles and others to a whole host of different kind of challenges, both organizationally and in a policy setting. And so I have now a team of 18 here in the United Kingdom that are super smart people that are leading on that work. So that's one clear connection. The second is you mentioned Messengers. And so, yeah, in 2020, along with Dr. Joseph Marks, a colleague of mine, we started to explore the psychology, not necessarily in terms of what Bob talks about, what you put into a message, but rather who delivers that message. I think many of us in the room, perhaps most of us in the room, will have had that experience where you have an idea or a proposal, a proposition to present. You think it's a good one, you've got data, you've got all the economics on your side, you present it to a group and it largely falls on deaf ears. When that happens, it's frustrating. But I wonder how many of you have also had the experience of a couple of days later, someone else comes along with the same idea that you had. And now everyone thinks it's the best idea since sliced bread. Okay. That frustration turns to annoyance. And that's essentially the program of work that Joe and I embarked on a few years ago, which is who gets listened to in a society, particularly one that's increasingly overwhelming, fragmenting, anxious, uncertain. Oftentimes now we're not necessarily listening to the evidence. We are making really quite important judgments, not on the basis of what's being said, but rather on who is saying what is being said. And Joe and my work looked at identifying those traits. There are broadly in the psychological literature 2 types of messenger that we listen to. We listen to hard messengers, messengers who have some sort of status over their audience. They're rich and famous, or they're competent, or they're perhaps attractive, physically attractive in that regard, or they're just overly dominant. Those are those kind of hard traits. Alternatively, sometimes we listen to soft messengers. Soft messengers are defined as those who have a connection with their audience. They don't seek to get over or won over on their audience, they seek to get along. And so those traits of warmth, vulnerability, trustworthiness, and charisma. So those are the 2 immediate connections to Bob's original work, and very grateful, of course, for these last 24 years or so when we've been working together and applying those.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Steve. I think my order of questions is not in the same order with Sat, so I hope you can bear with that. Kit, I'll go to you next, I think, if that's okay. From your work, it's involving interacting with boards, businesses, government departments, and trying to influence them perhaps on policy. So I'm interested in where influence and the psychology of persuasion comes into your own work, or perhaps through emerging technology as well.
I think, so the area of anti-racism and racism by its very nature is particularly challenging. So one of the first things that we have to look at is how we almost separate and divorce the sort of psychological connection with that idea of racism. So when you talk about sort of the messenger, a lot of the work that we have to do is looking at the message to start with, and almost reframing the idea and the notion of what it means to engage in that work, whether that be from a policy standpoint or organisationally. So working with leaders and organisations to separate themselves from that is a challenging personal conversation to have, even if it's related to an organisation. In terms of, I suppose, the work that Bob does, the specific elements that are particularly powerful are strangely reciprocity, in the sense of working with an organisation to help them, or a leader to help them understand what they will first get from you. And a lot of that is about creating an environment or a setting of safety that allows them to step out of that personal space into a place where they can look at the organisation in the round within the context of anti-racism, and then look at how we can move the organisation or their kind of understanding of anti-racism forward from that point.
Thank you very much.
Can I add to that? There's a particular practice that I've seen to be very effective in this direction, and it's called the convert communicator. The person who testifies, I used to be on that side of I used to feel that way, and I don't anymore. Something happened to me, I experienced an interaction or a connection that showed me that I was walking down the wrong street here. I needed to make a U-turn and come the other way because of what I've seen. But the person comes from the group that is the they as opposed to the we, but by bringing that person in, you've connected, you've bridged the they to the we, and people are willing to listen to that convert because of that, that unity connection.
If I can add, because actually, I suppose, we said reciprocity, but actually, and that's where unity comes into it. Within the work that we do, we sort of, these are the folks that we call allies, right? So, and actually, if you look at allyship in a slightly more forensic fashion, and we look at what is it that connects us and what is it that unifies us, you know, very often when I walk into the room and the people I'm talking to, I am the other. So, you know, the thing that we're trying to get unity on is not necessarily our background or characteristic, but rather what's the experience that we've just come from. And often it is that convert experience of, I used to think that way, or I used to operate that way, and I've been able to move myself forward. This is a journey that I can help you go on. And that's a particularly powerful element of influence.
Perfect, thank you so much.
Thanks, Bob.
Almut, the same question to you, I think. In your research, you cover neurodiversity as well as parents and carers. You no doubt encounter stereotypes, assumptions, received wisdoms that need influencing, challenging, or deconstructing, or perhaps stakeholders and funders that you would find it useful to influence.
Perhaps the performing arts are the best example here. So if you think that the performing arts are wild, wacky, and creative, that's what you see on stage. When you go backstage, it's gendered, it's hierarchical, and the Me Too movement is there for a reason. Because make no mistake, in most arts contexts, it's very, very few people calling the shots. Go away, watch the Bon Jovi documentary, bit of a rock fan. You've got unity in the band, even without Richie Sambora, but there is one person calling the shots, and it's Bon John. And I'm just also reminded of, actually it's a piece of data that David and I collected that we haven't yet written up. It was a focus group with classical dancers, and it was one of the corps de ballet dancers giving us a lovely example. She had prepared really well for her annual performance review with her director. She had built a very good relationship with the director. She had made sure she was seen in rehearsals. She had made sure that she had collected evidence. She had not missed one performance sick, which is very, very rare in ballet. She had danced 6 principal level roles that season. And she had lots of feedback from the critics, but also from other company members to say, actually, we would not be here if it wasn't for her always being reliable, always being there, and always giving a killer performance. And the director went, that's all really interesting, but thanks but no thanks was the answer. That's what the arts are like, because at the end of the day, aesthetic judgment is incredibly subjective. There are very ingrained power relationships, and particularly if you're a woman, and particularly so if you're a woman of color, it's very, very hard to break those. So this is an example of a context where it is very, very difficult to have any influence in certain positions.
Thank you, Almut.
I'll just add to that something that I think is really difficult for women, and that is to be brokers of information about themselves, the positivity of their performances or productivity and so on, because it goes against the stereotype. And when they do honestly present their case, they are perceived as pushy or uppity. And so what organization, this is a good thing to link Steve and Influence at Work and get, is to have structures in place where people don't have to do that themselves. There are supervisors, or there are evaluators, or there are people who present the case of others for promotions or opportunities or hiring decisions and so on, so that people don't have to do that themselves. For men, that's seen as something that's not out of keeping with the role of being assertive and agentic in a situation. For women, it is, and they shouldn't have to have that that barrier. The structure of the organization should allow them to have their evidence presented by someone who is valued in that organization rather than the candidate.
May I just quickly add to that? And obviously I'd never disagree with you, Bob. However. I do think that's important. I think it's important for organisations to create that. But I think one thing we should probably also try to counter is the need for that. So actually to also create the space and the environment and the knowledge that actually if I do present my own case, that actually that's okay and that's acceptable. And that should maybe be championed by those folks that you're just describing, not just to say that Bob must do it for me, but actually that if I do it for myself, Bob will support that action and then be able to then to help push from that perspective. So, never disagreeing with you, Bob.
I would never disagree with you. I think that's actually true, but what we should have is make sure that there are people in place who do the speaking for you, of your women doing that for women, minorities, so that message doesn't have to be outside of your category in order to be allowed in the interim until this is banished as a as a deficiency.
Stephen, I'll come to you with the same question. Where does psychology of persuasion connect with your organizational area? As the leader of a substantial financial institution, imagine some people will go to the well of authority, or the temptation might be there, but I'm wondering what other ways of influencing have you found useful?
I think there are, I come from 2 points of view. So we do have structures in place. So there are promotion panels, for example, where people will talk about someone in their team. They are joined by someone from a different team to give a perspective on someone as to whether they are ready for promotion. That'll be a detailed assessment, and there's a judgment applied around that. But you get breadth of perspective around that judgment. I have multiple stakeholders to think about. So I've got shareholders, I've got customers, I've got colleagues, I've got regulators, and they all come from different perspectives, and things are more important to some than others. So you have to constantly work through how do you... Okay.
So sometimes you need to think through, is that okay? Okay, it's still the same from my end, but anyway. You need to think through what do you want to influence and how do you influence that. I'm constantly amazed by the number of times I walk around the organisation. We've got 2,500 people in different locations and in different parts of the world, but the number of times I've heard, oh, Stephen said this, I think, did I? So things get interpreted in different ways down the organisation, and you have to be very thoughtful about that. But if I was I've learned from both being a chief executive and working for chief executives, if that chief executive's authority is by I'm telling you so, that doesn't last very long. People do not want to work for a leader like that, or at least people aren't very good. And when people do that, and I've seen it play out in my life, they tend to get people who just do as they're told, and you have to over-reward them or something else. And that might be okay for a while, but that tends to end up in a bad outcome. The final thing is you just need to make sure that, how do you make sure that when you're in a position of authority, hopefully unintentionally, you don't create too much persuasion on that. So how do you ensure that you get breadth of perspective? How do you ensure that you get other views? The point you made earlier about, actually I really like, can I get your advice rather than give me an opinion? That resonates a lot. But if you're not careful, you can rely on your own judgment or opinion too much. So how do you make sure that you get a breadth of perspective around you? In my experience, that turns into a much better outcome. But how you get that, how people feel safe to give you that. Sometimes that can be either against your own judgment, or it could be perceived as being critical towards me. I'm sure that must be uncomfortable for some people. So it's about creating that safe environment where people feel that they've got permission to express their views as they see it.
Perfect. Thank you very much.
I'll just add that the research very much supports what you're saying in that the extent to which you have collaboration and input into a decision increases the likelihood of a better decision, and very often leaders are reluctant to do that because they say, well, what if I don't decide for that? Do people feel diminished if I don't? My sense is that the leader never counts noses to make a decision. Yes. But the leader invites people in and says to them, your input is crucial to the ultimate decision. I may not follow it, but it is an important feature of allowing me to decide properly. And that usually works. People feel validated that they're invited in. Yeah.
So talking about influence, perhaps the next question to move on to is how do we do it ethically? Mm-hmm. So I'm curious, I'll go maybe Almut first with this one. Where do you see the harm of influence and persuasion in your own research, it being done maybe not in the most favorable way?
So thinking about the neurodiversity context, that's the other strand of my research, really thinking about neuro-inclusion and supporting people at work who are neurodivergent, such as from the autistic or dyslexic communities. For better, for worse, what you're getting at the moment is an extremely vocal advocacy movement online. And you have in psychology what you call the double empathy problem. What tends to happen is neurodivergent people tend to trust each other. Neurotypical people tend to trust each other. You get less trust and communication across the groups. So what you often find is that a certain thing starts on X, I'm no longer on X, couldn't take it anymore, or on LinkedIn, and then it kind of spiraled. So a good example in the realm of work was recently that any adjustment as work is reasonable. And that isn't the case because guess what? There's a job to be done, right? There are objectives to be delivered. Absolutely, we have to support people to do their work in the best possible way that suits their preferences. But the job still needs to be done, right? And we can't lower the threshold for some people and not for others. So that was an example for an urban myth that started somewhere and it absolutely spiraled out of control and actually has resulted in quite a number of law cases now where people took their employer to court and some won, some lost, but there is a lot of misinformation about because you get some very strong influencing voices.
Thank you. Kit as well, maybe I'll come to you next. Where in your work do you perhaps see influence maybe being done in a harmful way?
It's interesting because the entire conversation, is effectively underpinned by a set of ethics or values, right? I'm hoping we all want to move towards a place of anti-racism and equity. However, there are in a similar way to what we were just hearing, there are somewhat dissenting voices that still have influence and that are leaning on previously powerful statements and concepts to slightly derail, I suppose, the conversation that we have now. These are things such as, positive discrimination gone mad, as a powerful sort of driving concept and phrase and message, and working to help people to recognize and critically evaluate those, and also evaluate the reasons that those messages are so influential and powerful, is something which is quite important for then taking the conversation to a much more productive place.
I'm interested in your reflection on this as well, Bob. If we think about an age of information that we're in now, are we becoming more and more likely to rely on influence as cues, and does that open the door for putting us more at risk from people who would exploit it?
It does for people who choose to be unethical in the approach to influence. We've done some research inside the organization and to look at what the consequences of an unethical culture would be inside an organization, the harmful consequences for the vitality of the organization. That is, people who inside the organization are required to be deceptive in the way they deal with those outside, customers, investors, vendors, partners, clients, and so on. They're required to exaggerate or in some cases invent or counterfeit the information about the positivity of the organization and what it's capable of. And what we found is when we've looked at cultures with an ethical versus an unethical approach, where people are not pushed to do that, those people who are pushed to do that perform less effectively. Because of the stress associated with having to cheat as a part of their job, they get sicker. They're more likely to take times off to have health issues. They also perform less well. They also leave the organization to a greater extent. When that unethical culture exists, you get more turnover, which is enormously expensive for the bottom line, the costs of turnover. But this is the one I like the best because other people hadn't shown this before, but in our research, the implication is, if indeed people get sick, if they want to leave, and they do leave, those who leave are the ones who are uncomfortable with cheating. Those who stay are those who are comfortable with cheating. And they cheat the organization. Count on it. You've selected for cheaters. You've pulled the viper under your coat. And what we find is that malfeasance on the job, people stealing computers, people having under-the-table deals with vendors, and all of the ways that you cheat time cards and so on, and that all happens, and that eats away at the bottom line as well. So the message is, it's not just morally advisable to be ethical within your organization, it's financially advisable down the road. Yeah.
May I add, and I promise not to do this again, but I had a thought on the nature of authority when we think about ethical influence. So you were talking about the fact that when people are uncertain, they look outside themselves for authority, and that is something that, particularly in the line of work that we find ourselves in, is can be very challenging. I promise not to get on a soapbox about politics, but recent reports from the wonderful Kemi Badenoch, which described the nature of systemic racism. Does it exist in this country or does it not? Put into a formal report with folks who should know and who are academics, carried a lot more weight than a conversation that you and I may have. And so there is something about the misuse, I suppose, of authority, and how that can then have a huge influence on not just people but also organizations. I certainly saw, if we have a graph that's drawn in the air from the awful murder of George Floyd and the interest in anti-racism, and then the release of this report, which effectively substantiated falsely that systemic racism doesn't exist in the UK, and then the decrease in organisational interest, or at least the motivation for organisations to move in that direction, that was partly based on that authority. I've now been told this, and so that that sort of unethical sort of approach can really have a big impact.
Right.
Sorry.
Very welcome.
And I think for people interested in the 7 principles from Bob's keynote, will be pleased to know that Influence at Work does have a code of ethics on their website, which I checked beforehand. So anyone wanting to employ some of these techniques, maybe have a scan of that as well. Okie doke.
And I'll just say that people who violate our code of conduct for ethics We don't give them second chances. You can make mistakes, but you can't be dishonest and stay with us.
I like that.
Okay, I will move to, I think, maybe my last question, which is about education, and it perhaps ties in with ethics as well, and how we educate people about influence and the psychology of persuasion and ethics as well. So my question is, what value is there for higher education to teach students, irrespective of their chosen field of study, about influence and persuasion? Steve, I think I'll go to you first. Yeah.
Well, I think the value is high. But before we go to higher education, let me make a plea for, before you get to higher education. I have a vivid memory from when I was at school. I remember once getting a B+ for an assignment that I was asked to undertake in geography. I got a B+ for writing an essay about an oxbow lake and drawing a nice picture about it. The reason it is vivid in my mind is that Brian Fogarty, or Foggy as we called him, who was the geography teacher, this giant 6'5" man with an incredibly bad taste in waistcoats, was a particularly mean marker. So to get a B+ was, quite an achievement. It's the only one I ever got. But here's the point I want to make here. I remember getting the B+. I don't remember ever using what I learned about an oxbow lake ever again in my life. And I think one of the things that we might want to think about here is the market signal. So my understanding is, the last time I looked at it, that at the age of 16, about a half of 16-year-olds here in the United Kingdom, I think it's the same in the US and Australia, take an exam, typically here in the UK at GCSE, in a subject like geography. The percentage of same 16-year-olds that take an exam in psychology is less than 2%. So are we saying that geography is 25 times more important than psychology? If you then fast forward a couple of years and look to what undergraduates look for and the subjects they determine are going to be important to them and that they have to pay for, by the way, the ratio is reversed. About 20 times more undergraduates choose a course that is either specifically psychology or has some psychological or behavioral science element to it compared to geography. So I think we need to look at the market signal here. If 18-year-olds are prepared to pay £9,000 plus per year, get into multiple tens of thousands of pounds worth of debt that a lot of them are unlikely to pay off over the course of their careers, and they're choosing psychology over other subjects, for me, that seems to make sense that we bring it much, much earlier into the educational system. I think at 10, 11, 12, 13, we teach kids all sorts of things. It might be helpful for them to kind of know how they're influenced, why they influenced others, what groups they decide that they want to hang out with, what groups they choose to engage with, what groups they decide that they don't want to engage with in those instances. That's, I think, where we need to start. And it strikes me that, one of the things that higher education needs to do, I know Dill, as head of the school here, is really keen now on furthering an education agenda in, say, MBA programs where behavioral science is actually a core component. I think the idea of having a behaviorally informed MBA is a magnificent one. It's one that absolutely should be supported. It will likely be the world's first as well. And I think it just speaks to the needs that we're hearing. Pretty much every problem that we have that we're faced with at Influence at Work when people come to us is a people issue. Our business plan works well on a spreadsheet and on a PowerPoint. The moment we put people into it, things kind of get screwed up a little bit. So I think it's going to be a vital part of any core higher education program. But I'd go one stage further and say we need to start younger.
Yeah. Great. Thank you very much. Oh. No. We do have time for a few more responses, though. Ahmed, I might go to you next. What would you teach with regards to persuasion and influence?
I would teach people about trust, because trust is the glue that holds organizations together, that holds society together. Listen up, future UK government, right? That's what we need to build. And you can only build trust with radical acceptance of people, regardless of their skin color, regardless of their neurotype. And I don't mean that in the sense that anything goes, but you do need an environment where you create psychological safety. Psychological safety is an environment where it's okay to make mistakes. You learn from them, you dust yourself down, you move on, but we still accept each other for who we are. And if we can facilitate that in classrooms, and also role model that ourselves, I think the onus is also on us as educators. And I think that's a good job well done.
Fantastic. And maybe some lessons as well from Influence about how to build that trust through something like repeated reciprocal exchange and self-disclosure.
Also, the willingness to admit mistakes. That establishes your credibility, your honesty.
Then I think maybe another way to think about the question is, and if I go to you, Stephen, thinking about your own career, what have you used with regards to persuasion and influence that you think would be useful for people entering or re-entering the workforce? What have you learned that you would have liked to know from the beginning, do you think?
It's really interesting. So I've been in my current role for 3 years as of last week. I'm now the longest serving member of the executive team, so there's been a lot of change for a whole variety of reasons. I don't think I managed to attract anyone on pay. Doesn't mean I don't pay well, we pay well for performance, but the people I got to join the team could have got paid that or more elsewhere. So why did they join? They joined really for purpose of what we do, and we help people get a mortgage, for example, that a high street bank won't, in a good way. Being part of a team, so like-minded, not necessarily everyone the same, but principles, culture, values being aligned, both individually, team, organisation, transparency. They joined for the challenge, because what we need to do, and we're doing okay, is not easy. So it's a really interesting thing for them to learn, develop and grow. And they will make mistakes, we will make mistakes, I make mistakes. So it's about how we learn from that and be open and transparent around that. At the same time, in my experience, the people who do best in a business context are really those who did best at school. Because you need to be more balanced than just pure academic. People are people. They tend to be motivated in different ways. Different people are motivated in different ways. Different people perform in different ways. And I've definitely learned that the more diverse your team, experience, perspective, background, age. The oldest person on my team is 60. The youngest is 35. Now that brings its own challenges, but a couple are neurodiverse. One is quite autistic, but super great around data. So getting that breadth of perspective onto a team, I'm not sure I would have, I think you can get that from a course, but you've got to learn your way through some of that. I think the other thing, just going back to sort of age, we saw this at the Social Mobility Commission, but I think there should be more of that at a younger age in education. But at a very young age, stereotypical around gender creeps in. In fact, even if you look at sort of what boys and girls are learning at school, they are typically learning that boys do one job and girls do a different job. And they're learning that by the age of 7. And that turns into confidence and what I've got permission to do or expected to do. So breaking that down with role models, confidence, influence at a younger age, really important.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Amazing. We're doing good for time. So maybe I will come to Bob for a final thought. So a few weeks ago, there was an article in The Guardian and the Wall Street Journal talking about the problem with nudge. And I think this has been for a few years now. Feels like behavioral science maybe is not the shiny new thing that it once was, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. as sort of risks come with fads as
Yeah.
well.
Yeah.
So I'm curious, Bob, what do you think the future holds for persuasion and influence? Is there anything you're particularly excited about?
There are two things that, let me answer that question by saying there are two things I'm excited about seeing occur that I think have not yet occurred in behavioral science. One is an emphasis on persistence of the effects that we uncover, the durability, the lasting nature of a change. Too much of the time we have focused on a temporary change, or at least measured a change and then leave it and don't look to see how long it stays in place. I think that has to be done to a much greater extent, because those are the structures that we want. Those are the influence attempts and successes that we want to attain, so that we don't have to be there all the time providing the treatment and providing monitoring or oversight, that there are changes that take place that lend themselves to continued action because they are self-reinforcing. They lead people in the right direction and so on. We need to identify those that have that capacity to a greater extent. So there's persistence, and the other is resistance. What we've looked at almost entirely in persuasion science anyway is the ability to create change in an audience. I think we need to invest in teaching audiences how to resist change that is imposed on them in unethical or undue fashion. So whether misinformation, disinformation, all the deep fakes, all these things that are coming on the horizon, we have to be able to teach people how to recognize, resist, deflect, reject those, and identify those that are not valid.
Which is probably becoming more and more something we need increasingly.
Yeah.
Okay, Steve, I think, did you want to jump?
I can speak to that. I've read both these articles. I've seen lots and lots of different comments about these things as well. And I think largely they're right, okay? If you come to the market with something that's cheap and easy, people are going to be super interested, super attracted to that. But let's be really clear about this. Changing behavior is not easy. Changing people's behavior, changing people's minds is really, really hard. And I think this promise of the nudge, the behavioral science, the small thing that we can do that has an immediate impact, I think that just attracts people into the field, okay? It's the headline, if you like. It's the above the fold. Bob's exactly right. The thing that we really need to be doing now is actually looking at what are these impacts that we're actually having that are sustainable, and to be really honest with ourselves that what influences people in the moment and has immediate impact is likely to be very, very different to the set of structures that are actually going to create a persistent change. There's a difference between influence and persuasion. And you'll hear Bob and I use the terms interchangeably. They're very, very different. Very, very different. Influence is just about an immediate impact, a change in behavior. Persuasion is about changes in minds, in structures that are durable, as Bob says, that you can leave and you can go back and you find that that change has actually persisted. And that's where we're going now, I think. Nudges essentially, I think, highlighted the promise of applied behavioral science, but it's teams like, I'm looking at, no surprise that it's actually 3 women that have actually just led a big program of work in environmental change that's now endured for 4 years. Not a nudge, that's a big program of infrastructural and persuasive change. And that's where we need to go now, David. Enough of the small things. Let's make sure that it's the right small things that are leading to the biggest sustainable differences.
Perfect.
I
Thank you
promise
very much.
I wouldn't, but I don't think we can. Emerging technology and behavioural science. So if we are thinking about what's persistent and what's durable, our reliance and our dependence and our perception actually of artificial intelligence as an authority is something which is very much driving how we operate. So when we think about what we rely on, what we resist, I think also there's got to be some perspective on our understanding that what we currently do is almost outsource a lot of our decision making. And also the responsibility almost for the ethical sort of arbitration of itself. And that's something that as we think about human behavior in partnership with emerging technology, which is what we're hoping we will be moving towards, rather than kind of proxies or outsourcing, that is something that also we need to think about, and I'm hoping that research will be pushing that way.
Perfect, thank you. Right, I'm already getting the signal that I'm running over, despite being a bit optimistic earlier, but there we go, that's the
That may be my fault.
overconfidence bias for you all. So, will you please all join a round of applause for our wonderful panel members? Thank you so much, everybody. We do, of course, have a Q&A, so if anyone wants to ask questions for any of our panel members, if you please pop up your hand, and then if you just wait, someone will bring a microphone over to you, and then snatch it back, I think. So, has someone got a roving mic? Yeah. Who do you want to go to?
She's going to ask the question.
Oh, is it? Yeah, okay.
I love that. Give me the mic.
Thank you, Professor Cialdini and all our dear panel members. My name is Oksana. I'm a psychology student here at Birkbeck. And I wanted to ask you your opinion, your experience on the role of the presentation skills, the delivery, the energy and charisma in influence versus, what not really versus, but the kind of proportion and balance of the content of the message itself. So it's like a bit of a case when you present your idea, nobody hears, nobody noticed, and then someone else comes with a better voice or better delivery, better energy, and he can sell kangaroos to Australia and easily, and he's been noticed. So on your experience, on your opinion, what is the kind of a level of the proportion of presentation skills and delivery and content of the message itself in the power of influence?
I think Steve is the right one to answer that question. He wrote the book on messengers. Yeah.
Thanks. Okay, I think the starting point is to say that there is no replacement for good information, for good evidence. No doubt about that, okay? Our ideal scenario is that we inform people into a particular point of view, a change that is the right one for them. But we also recognize that from the moment we wake up in the morning to the moment we go to bed at night, we are just simply overwhelmed with stimulus and data. So how do you decide what is the right piece of information to pay attention to? And so this is where these messenger effects really come into play. And it is the case. You know, Joe and I took a deep, long look at TED Talks, for example. Turns out that there are hundreds and thousands of TED Talks that are available online. A lot of them are about the same subject, the same topic, you know, leadership, for example, or the role of AI, or the future of technology, whatever it is. And there's absolutely clear evidence that shows that those TED Talk presenters that are more charismatic, that use more hand movements, that talk more about stories than statistics, are significantly more likely to have a high number of viewers, a disproportionately high number of viewers. The way they actually study this is fascinating as well. They use computer technology to actually take away all the human characteristics of these speakers, turn them into kind of animated stick insect type of kind of things, and then watch when people actually clap and applaud, and they look at attention in the audience. So it's important. I think both things are important. I think when it comes to presentation, hugely, hugely important. You know, one of the things that we advise now is our teams is lead with the story or lead with the experience, and then use your data, your evidence, your statistics to back up that story. It's really interesting. Notice that I think that people rarely argue against your story. They'll be really belligerent about your statistics and your evidence. Even the most important people that you think would pay attention to the evidence are also not immune to this. I see Jürgen Pietzers in the audience here. He's a medical doctor. We've done a ton of research on medical doctors. You ask them, what is actually going to be the thing that actually influences me to use this drug? Is it the evidence, or is it the presentation of the story about this evidence? And they say it's always the evidence. But when you actually look at what actually convinces them, it's always a story. It's always a story. So it's important, increasingly so. There's no substitute for good evidence, but the way it's packaged is becoming increasingly important. The message has been, I think, often supplanted with the messenger.
Let me just reinforce that with some evidence that suggests, from my own understanding of the way that the persuasion process works, strong counter-arguments are more persuasive than strong arguments. Mm-hmm. And one reason that stories are so effective is that we don't counter-argue stories. In our mind, we accept the story. It is reality. It is being told to us. We don't counter-argue it. We counter-argue assertions. We counter-argue claims. We don't counter. But the key, as Steve suggested, is to base your story on valid evidence. Mm-hmm. And then you reverse engineer it so that the story comes first, but it is grounded in evidence. And then you win the day.
I think I've seen a few consultancy students in, and hopefully that will ring true with what you're finding on your consultancy projects at the moment, the importance of the story and the storytelling. Okay, got another question. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Professor Cialdini, so my name is Jürgens. Funny enough, your book Influence, I've read a few years ago for the first time, and I instantly turned to a proper behavioral science nerd, and read almost around about 50 books afterwards. So thank you for that. And one question that I'm grappling with is to do with democracy, right? In a democracy, we assume individuals need to have autonomy, right? Now, we live in an age of misinformation, disinformation, fake news, however you want to package it. The first question that I want to have is maybe twofold. How do we deal with the issue of who is the arbiter of truth, right? And then the second part of the question is, using behavioral public policy, right? We use techniques to use heuristics-based decision-making in order to get the populations to move in the direction we want them to move. Mm-hmm. Essentially, potentially undermining autonomy. And how do we deal with that while maintaining the autonomy in an ethical way, but still being able to move the population the right way that's beneficial to everybody?
Yeah. So okay, great question. I'll say something that probably is controversial. Autonomy is overrated. Collective and greater good orientation is underappreciated. So I think we have to yield the extent to which that we are individuals who are standing out and having our own way and deciding what's best for us, and we need to defer and reduce that value. I don't dismiss that it's important, but it's overvalued, I think. The extent to which we can recognize that the greater good should be the thing that we prioritize over our own interests. Secondly, the way that we identify which of these heuristic techniques and tactics that we use to move people in a particular direction, whether that's appropriate or not, is whether that. So I'm going to say that I'm just going to use the 7 principles of influence. I'm not going to try to defend others. Does that truly exist in the situation? Is there true authority supporting this position? Is there true diminishing availability of this value unless we take an action to resuscitate it or reclaim it? Is there a genuine trend in the direction that we are claiming is the right way to go, that we can see, look, your citizens, your contemporaries are moving? Is that true? Then we're allowed to it. We're allowed to employ it. we're not allowed to manufacture it. We're not allowed to use that heuristic because it works, and that we've undermined its validity by exaggerating or counterfeiting it in that policy approach. Yeah.
Yeah, go Stephen.
Just give me an example. So autonomous is interesting. So do I want people to feel that they can speak up, come up with ideas, do things? Yes. To do exactly what they want in the way they want it? No. So rules exist for a reason on the whole. And I'll give you a really good example. A few years ago, there was a lady, could have easily been a man, but it was a lady on this occasion who I knew very well. And she was a really good business banker. And she was very close to her customers. She was very capable, very skilled, very experienced. One of her customers was super persuasive and managed to persuade her to lend her an amount of money that was way beyond the authority she had. And when she put that proposal through the appropriate structures to get agreement, or not, as the case may be, it was declined. She still found a way to lend that money. That was about £1 million, and it never got repaid. And she lost her job. That's her career over. I think it's all well intended, but it comes down to she was over-persuaded. She didn't have sort of counter-judgment around her. And autonomy exists to a reason, to a degree. So you have to have rules, processes, and procedures in place. Otherwise, anarchy happens.
I think just to add to that, I think sometimes we get confused, I think, about this notion of autonomy, but actually something perhaps that's to strive towards more is that sense of empowerment, because even with an empowered person or people, there is still a sense of those rules and a sense of certain parameters within which we should work within and operate. But actually, I know what the boundaries are. I just feel very comfortable moving to them and taking the right decision as to when I might need to step out and ask for more help, more assistance, and more, whatever it might be. I think maybe it's just language, but I think actually there's something in the action of the autonomous actor that can lead to anarchy, whereas empowerment is a slightly more constructive kind of version of that. Within a framework, yeah.
Yeah. Again, it's hard, and I'm not feeling overly optimistic about it at the moment, if the truth be known. We've heard this evening essentially about this set of 7 universal principles as effective shortcuts to good decisions in a crazy information overloaded world. One of the things we're starting to notice now is, how do you shortcut the shortcuts? This is where we're at now. And I'll just give you one brief example and embarrass someone in the room as well. I think one of the most accomplished new researchers in the field of behavioral science is a lady by the name of Eloise Copland. She ran an experiment a couple of years ago in her laboratory at University College London when she was a researcher there. Here's what she did. She had people come in. She had them undertake a simple test. Okay? Categorize these shapes. If you get it right, you win 10 quid. If you get it wrong, you lose 10 quid. Okay? You play the game 10 times. You don't know what shape is what, and so it's essentially a coin flip. Okay? So if you play the game 10 times, it's a coin flip. On average, you're going to win 5 times, okay? And that's exactly what happens. So what she then does is she introduces this concept of experts, people that can be trusted. She sees that other people are playing the game and that they actually play the game pretty accurately. What do people do? They follow the expert, which is how the world should work, right? Someone has instrumental value. They have greater knowledge than us. And so these amateurs who don't know what the right thing to do is start to follow the experts. And they are rewarded accordingly. This is where Copland gets a little bit sneaky. Because what she then does is she says, well, what if I was to pit an expert against someone who has no idea what they're doing, but they have an affiliation to me? Okay? The person that you've been following who's an expert is dissimilar to you. They voted differently to you in the last election. There's a polarization of that expertise. What do people do? You would like to think that people are able to set aside that dissimilarity and continue to follow the expert, okay? But they don't. They pay to be wrong. In over 60% of cases, they will ignore the expert and choose the person that's most like them, even though this person has no idea about the task, has no instrumental value or information to present. And I think that's kind of where we are now. And I don't know how we deal with it, actually. You know, we're increasing in a situation where we're making more and more difficult decisions. And we don't know what the right thing to do is. So instead of choosing the right thing, it seems to me we're just choosing a side.
Thanks, Steve. I'll go to a question. We've got a few online, so I'm going to pick one of these. So the question is, and I imagine Bob and Steve may be placed for this, do these principles work across cultures, i.e. in non-weird cultures, or is that research that needs to be done?
I know of no research that shows that these principles aren't effective across cultures. They seem, wherever you find, I was just talking to a behavioral anthropologist who was in a very remote area of an island in the Philippines, and he was showing the effects of these principles. Reciprocity, for example. Does anyone think reciprocity doesn't work somewhere else? Or authority or social proof? These scarcity, these are fundamental features of the human condition. But the priorities associated with those principles shift from culture to culture. The weights of them shift from culture to culture. So the research suggests that you have to know the precedents and histories of a given culture to know which of the principles is likely to be most effective in that particular group. So you're not done just knowing the 7 principles. If you want to optimize this, you have to recognize what the history of the members of that culture are, what that history is, in order to influence those people properly. Yeah.
Probably just time for one more, maybe. Yes, please. Chloe, will you get the... Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for all the insights you've shared. I'm Khadija, along with my classmate friend Carla. We're both psychological and behavioral science students at LSE. And similar to yourself, when I was actually in secondary school, college area time, I was introduced to Professor Cialdini's book, and then from there became like a behavioral science nerd. I went on to study it.
Let me just say that book has been very good to me. And it's been around for a long time in a lot of culture. I had a colleague from Poland, Professor Wilhelmina Wosinska, who said to me, you know, Robert, your book influence is so famous in Poland, my students think you're dead. Okay, go on. Good, please go ahead.
It is quite surreal to be in front of you today, but yeah, and you're so down to earth and humble, so it's great. Actually, so I was actually leading on to your point, Steve, about schools and, you know, being introduced in schools, and I completely agree that psychology should be introduced in schools, because that's when I was introduced to it. So 2-part question, actually. Number one, the fact that what does the ethics, or how would you advise, schools against, you know, the misuse of psychology and behavioral science amongst students secondary school age, where, you know, they are possibly could misuse all these techniques that they're learning at such an impressionable age, for example. Second question, which could be answered by anybody actually, was the fact that we mentioned earlier that people don't argue with stories, and in the age of disinformation, people are speaking like Donald Trump, for example, speaking to the guts rather than speaking, you know, to the head, and that's where they find success. Whereas the media and government are now fighting the gut with logistics. So that's, you know, yeah, I was just wondering your thoughts on that. So the advice from Steve first.
Well, I'll be super brief given the time, and I think it's important that there are others on the panel that talk to that. I don't think I have an adequately well-constructed and thought-through answer about how we do that in schools. The only thing that I would advocate is at Influence at Work, we have 3 rules that we apply to any behavior change program that we put in place, or any information or evidence that actually supports that. The first is the information or the evidence that we're actually using based on evidence, is it true? Secondly, is it wise? And what I mean by that is, are we likely to ensure that if we do something, we don't have an unintended consequence? And the third thing is, does it pass the favourite sister test? And the favourite sister test is, would I be happy with someone else doing this to my favourite sister? And largely, if we can say yes to those 3 things, we generally find ourselves on good ground. So that might be a good starting point. I take your point about the different politicians, and the one thing I'd actually say, which I think is really important when we start to talk about the trust in communicators, is to recognise that trust and truth aren't the same thing. Okay, there's we like to think that in order to build our trustworthiness, we should be truthful. There's no evidence to actually support that. Trust essentially is your ability to predict how someone else will behave in the future and how confident you are in doing that. Okay, so it's I think it befuddles people sometimes when they see someone like Trump, who has a Washington Post totalizer in terms of how many times he lies. Every time he lies, trust in Trump goes up. Okay, why is that? Because the people that listen to Trump go, well, he's telling my lies. And we laugh, but it's super serious.
So let me add on to that point about how do we teach ethical influence, or how do we teach influence in the school systems at earlier ages than we typically do? And I think the key is there can't just be a module on influence. There has to be a companion module on ethics of influence. That's how we teach the lack of harm, that we divert the effectiveness away from harmful effectiveness. We do it. And we were talking about AI approaches. I think we ought to be investing in AI programs, learning models that identify unethical uses. Right now, they're just looking at effectiveness. How do we identify those? And we should run those, any appeal that we get through the AI system that identifies what is immoral or unethical.
I may have to do it again.
You may, yes. Well, you're very welcome.
I think there's a huge potential for that as an area, but I think we probably need to get our house in order in terms of our understanding of ethics and how that applies to AI before we do what we have been doing over the last few years, which is the quick outsource. I don't know how to unpick this issue. AI can probably do it much more quickly and effectively than I can. So yes, but perhaps you're just so much of a visionary. It's a bit further off than now. Because I think that is what people are starting to try to do. It alarms me, with a small a, because we're not quite there yet. I think there's got to be a much more grounded underpinning of our own understanding of ethics, a re-understanding of truth, before we start leaving it to the algorithms to figure out. Sorry.
No, I couldn't agree with you more. But we have to do it.
Oh, agreed.
We have to undertake that effort.
We agree. We agree, really.
If we have maybe just one last reflection, Stephen, and then we'll probably need to move on.
Okay. I mean, in my experience, look, you need an element of data to help with a decision. But if you rely purely on the data, and data can be manipulated in any way you want, then you tend to make a poor judgment through time. Or you never get to a decision point. You keep looking for the data and what else is it telling you. Secondly, is in many cases, the data comes out of a black box. So how do you know actually what the black box actually is, how the algorithm works and so forth? So if you're going to find yourself in a decision-making position, which you will do, what is that black box? How does it work? And do you believe the data? One of the biggest cultural things I'm trying to shift in my organisation is too often people crank a handle, they take what comes out, and that's what they then do. They don't think about that. They don't think, is this right? And if it is right, do I like the answer? How can I make it better, quicker, faster, whatever it might be? So it really is about taking that data point and understanding it, and then do you like it? If you don't like it, how can you do something, change an input to get to a better outcome?
Thank you. Right, I'm going to be unpopular again and draw the panel to a close. Would you all put your hands together and give a warm round of applause for our panelists? Bob, Kit, Stephen, Almut and Steve. It's truly a special time, I think, to be able to celebrate 40 years of influence and have Bob here in person. I think the first time I had the opportunity to author a module was about a decade ago, and of course Principles of Persuasion was in there, and no surprises, it was the most popular part of that module, with the majority of students choosing to write on the Principles of Persuasion. And this was in a Academy of Contemporary Music, and this was about audience and consumer psychology. And yeah, they ate it up, and I caught the teaching bug, I suppose, from there, and influence has been a mainstay in my teaching from there. So I'll say a huge thank you to Bob for all of the years of entertainment, enlightenment, education, and also making my life easier, because it always helps when you've got good content to give students. And all of our panel members, thank you so much, Kit, Stephen, Almut and Steve. And to all of you for joining us. We've got people online as well, so thank you so much for all of your attention, your questions. The night's not over. We'll be going through in a minute for some mingling, networking, so hopefully we can pick up any strands or conversations that we didn't quite get to finish off. I think we probably could have talked all evening, but we have to be mean. Right, so that's all from us, folks.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.